Karen Johnson was used to getting her way. First-class flights, VIP lounges, and special treatment weren't just privileges. To her, they were expectations. But when she walks into an airport lounge one day and decides that certain people don't belong, she quickly learns that privilege isn't as untouchable as she thought. What starts as a minor complaint spirals into a chain of events that strips Karen of everything she once took for granted: her status, her access, and even her ability to leave the airport. As mistake after mistake catches up to her, she faces a humiliating fall from grace, surrounded by the very people she once dismissed. But when she reaches her lowest point, an unexpected encounter forces her to confront a reality she's never had to face before. How does someone like Karen handle being powerless for the first time in her life? And will she learn the lesson staring her in the face, or let her pride destroy what little she has left? Before we begin, make sure to subscribe for more gripping stories like this one. And tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Karen stormed toward the front desk, her heels clicking aggressively against the polished marble floor. The scent of freshly brewed espresso wafted through the air, mingling with the soft hum of conversation. Behind the counter, a young woman named Maria greeted her with a professional smile. "Good afternoon, ma'am. Welcome to the VIP lounge. How may I assist you?" Karen leaned in slightly, lowering her voice as if she were about to share a state secret. "I don't mean to be rude," she said, though her tone made it clear that rudeness was exactly what she intended. "But this place isn't exactly what I expected. It seems a bit open, don't you think?" Maria blinked, unfazed. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Could you clarify what you mean?" Karen scoffed. "It's just that I was under the impression that this was an exclusive space. But looking around, it's clear that anyone can just walk in here." Her gaze swept across the room, landing pointedly on a tall black man in a tailored navy blue suit. He sat comfortably, flipping through the pages of a book, completely unaware or perhaps deliberately ignoring her scrutiny. Maria followed Karen's eyes and immediately understood. The polite smile on her lips remained, but her voice took on a firmer edge. "Ma'am, this lounge is reserved for first-class passengers and premium members, regardless of their background. If you have a valid membership, you're more than welcome to stay." Karen stiffened. "Of course I have a membership." Maria arched an eyebrow, already sensing what was coming next. "May I see your boarding pass or membership card, please?" Karen hesitated. Her confidence wavered, but only for a moment. She quickly regained her composure and offered a tight-lipped smile. "Oh, I'm actually a VIP member with a different airline," she said smoothly, waving her hand dismissively. "I use their lounges all the time, but I figured this one wouldn't be too different." Maria nodded, unfazed. She reached for the tablet beside her and began scrolling. "Unfortunately, ma'am, this lounge is exclusive to members of our specific airline. Your status with another carrier does not grant you access here." Karen's nostrils flared. "That's ridiculous. Do you even know who I am?" Maria's smile widened slightly, her patience unwavering. "I do not, ma'am. But I'd be happy to check if you're eligible for a one-time guest pass for a fee." Karen's face darkened. "Pay extra? For a lounge she should have access to?" Before she could respond, a low chuckle drifted from behind her. She turned sharply, meeting the amused gaze of the tall black businessman she had noticed earlier. He had put his book down, his expression mildly entertained. "Quite the predicament," he mused. "It seems that exclusivity comes with fine print, doesn't it?" Karen's jaw clenched. She needed a way out of this mess. And fast. With a forced smile, she turned away from Maria and casually gestured toward a nearby security officer, silently signaling for him to approach. Surely he would understand. Surely he would help. But as the officer nodded and began walking toward them, Karen would soon realize, perhaps for the first time in her life, that power and privilege didn't always bend in her favor. Because when he reached them, he didn't stop at the people she was silently trying to point out. He stopped in front of her. "Excuse me, ma'am," the officer said, his voice calm but firm. "Do you have a valid first-class ticket or lounge membership?" Karen's stomach dropped. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. For the first time in a long while, Karen felt the heat of embarrassment creeping up her neck. She wasn't used to being questioned, especially not like this. Her fingers tightened around the handle of her designer suitcase as she forced a smile, trying to keep her composure. "There must be some kind of misunderstanding," she said smoothly. "I always have lounge access. Maybe your system is just outdated." Maria remained poised, her fingers still hovering over the tablet screen. The security officer, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a badge reading Officer Reynolds, didn't flinch. "Then, if you could kindly provide your membership information or boarding pass, ma'am, we'll clear this up quickly," he said. Karen hesitated, glancing toward the other passengers. Some had begun to watch the exchange with mild interest. The businessman in the navy blue suit, Jamal, though she didn't know his name yet, had picked up his book again, though the slight smirk on his lips suggested he was still listening. Karen knew she had two choices. She could admit she had no valid membership and leave quietly, or she could try to bluff her way through. She chose the latter. With a theatrical sigh, she reached into her handbag, pretending to search for something. "Ugh," she muttered. "I must have left my membership card in my other bag. But like I said, I'm a VIP with another airline. This is ridiculous." Maria, still calm, nodded. "I understand, ma'am. But without verification, I'm afraid we can't allow entry." Karen's patience was wearing thin. "Are you serious?" she snapped. "I'm clearly someone who belongs here. Meanwhile, you're letting in just anyone." She cut herself off, realizing she had spoken too loudly. A hush settled over the nearby passengers. A few exchanged glances. Maria's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes hardened. Jamal exhaled softly, shaking his head. He didn't need to say anything. Karen could feel his judgment from across the room. "Ma'am," Officer Reynolds interjected, his voice even. "Let's step aside for a moment." Karen's heartbeat quickened. "Step aside." "Yes," he said. "Just a routine check to confirm your eligibility." Karen felt a flicker of panic. This wasn't going the way she planned. "I don't have time for this," she huffed, taking a step back. "I'll just go make a quick phone call and straighten this out." She turned on her heel, intent on walking away. With some dignity, but she nearly collided with a flight attendant. A young woman with dark hair and a crisp airline uniform stood in her path. Karen barely recognized her at first, but the flicker of recognition in the attendant's eyes was unmistakable. "Oh," the woman said, tilting her head. "It's you." Karen frowned. "Excuse me. You don't remember me, do you?" the flight attendant continued, her voice smooth but laced with something else. Satisfaction? Karen blinked. "Should I?" The woman smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You yelled at me this morning at check-in," she said. Something about how incompetence was ruining the airline industry. Karen's stomach sank. Now she remembered. The same woman had been working at the check-in counter earlier, when Karen had demanded an upgrade. When she had been told none were available, she had unleashed a tirade about lazy employees and horrible service. And now, here the woman was again blocking her exit. "Small world, huh?" the attendant said lightly. Then she turned to Officer Reynolds. "Everything okay here?" Reynolds gave a small nod. "We're just verifying lounge access." The flight attendant's smile widened. Interesting, because this morning she was quite vocal about not flying first class. Said it was a waste of money. A murmur rippled through the lounge. Karen clenched her jaw. "That's not what I said, but you aren't flying first class today, are you?" the attendant pressed. Karen had had enough. "This is harassment," she exploded. "I will not be treated like a criminal just because I expect certain standards in a VIP lounge." Reynolds remained calm. "No one is treating you like a criminal, ma'am. But we do have policies to enforce." Karen turned to Maria, grasping for control. "Fine," she spat. "If I can't stay, then neither should he." She jabbed a manicured finger toward Jamal. Maria's brow furrowed. "Excuse me." "I mean, how do you know he belongs here?" she demanded. "Did you check his credentials?" Jamal, who had been silent up until now, finally looked up. He sighed and reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a sleek black card. Maria barely glanced at it before nodding. "Mr. Carter is a lifetime VIP member." No verification needed. Karen froze. Now, Maria added, her voice kind but firm, we need you to leave. Karen opened her mouth to argue, but no words came. She had lost. And, as Officer Reynolds gently gestured toward the exit, Karen realized this was only the beginning of her nightmare. Karen felt her stomach twist as Officer Reynolds stepped aside, motioning toward the lounge exit. Every fiber of her being screamed against compliance. She wasn't the kind of woman who got escorted out of places, she was the kind who belonged. The kind who breezed past velvet ropes, who demanded and received upgrades, who deserved better treatment. And yet, here she was. The room was silent, save for the occasional clinking of glasses and the low hum of distant conversations. But Karen felt the weight of the passengers' eyes on her. Some stole glances, pretending not to watch. Others barely concealed their amusement. Worst of all, that businessman Jamal Carter hadn't even looked up again, as if she were already irrelevant. No, Karen wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing her leave humiliated. With a huff, she squared her shoulders and flipped her hair over one shoulder. Fine, she said coolly. I wouldn't want to stay in this lounge anyway. Clearly, the standards have plummeted. She grabbed her suitcase and turned sharply only to nearly trip over it. The lounge doors were just a few feet away. She just needed to walk through them, book another flight, and pretend none of this ever happened. She took a step forward and her phone rang. Karen nearly sighed in relief. Perfect timing. She could use this as an excuse to step aside, to act as if she had more important things to deal with than a petty lounge dispute. She reached into her designer handbag, pulled out her phone, service suspended. Karen froze. She tapped the screen again. Nothing. A small message at the top read, "Your account has been temporarily disabled due to non-payment." Her blood ran cold. This wasn't possible. She always paid her bills. Didn't she? Her stomach twisted again. She'd been so busy planning this trip, arguing with hotel managers, switching credit cards for better rewards. Had she forgotten to settle her phone bill? No. This had to be a mistake. Something wrong. The voice was smooth, casual, infuriatingly amused. Karen turned, already knowing who it was. Jamal Carter had set his book aside. He wasn't smiling, but there was a glint of something in his eyes, like he was watching an old movie he had seen play out before. Karen bristled. Nothing is wrong. Jamal nodded slowly. Right. Just checking. Her jaw tightened. She turned. Back toward the doors, moving faster now. She needed to get to the main concourse, find customer service, fix her phone, and Karen. The voice was different this time. Older. Deeper. Karen stopped dead in her tracks. An elderly man sitting near the lounge's bar had turned in his seat, staring at her with recognition. She didn't know him, at least, not right away. But then he smiled, shaking his head. I thought I recognized you, he mused. You are the woman who got banned from the JFK first-class lounge last year, aren't you? Karen's breath caught in her throat. A murmur rippled through the lounge. People were definitely watching now. She forced a laugh, though it came out thin and unnatural. I think you're mistaken. The man chuckled. Am I? Because I remember quite clearly. You threw a tantrum over a champagne brand, called the staff incompetent, and then security had to escort you out. Karen's mouth went dry. Maria, still standing at the counter, raised an eyebrow. Is that true? Karen felt herself drowning. This wasn't supposed to be happening. She had been in control. But now it was like every decision she had made, every smug comment, every entitled demand was coming back to haunt her at once. She needed to get out. Now. Without another word, she turned on her heel, yanked her suitcase behind her, and pushed through the lounge doors. And then she heard the announcement. Attention passengers. We have a baggage update for Karen Johnson. Your luggage has been rerouted and is currently en route to Anchorage, Alaska. Please visit the service desk for assistance. The world around her went still. Her luggage. Alaska. She wasn't going to Alaska. Karen's head snapped toward the customer service counter. A young woman behind the desk was already bracing herself for impact. Karen stormed toward her. There's been a mistake, she barked. My bag isn't supposed to be on that flight. Fix it." The woman blinked. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but the system shows that your bag was checked into the wrong flight. We'll do our best to retrieve it," but Karen cut her off. "Not retrieve it. I need it now. I have important things in there." "Yes, ma'am," the woman said patiently. "But the soonest we can get it back is—" She typed something into her computer, then winced. "Tomorrow." Karen's pulse pounded. This was unreal. And then, because things had to get worse, someone nearby let out a soft laugh. She turned just in time to see Jamal Carter walking past, shaking his head with a smirk. Karen clenched her fists. This wasn't over. Karen's heart pounded in her chest as she gripped the counter, her nails pressing into the polished surface. "Tomorrow," she repeated, her voice strained. "That's not acceptable. I need my bag now." The young woman at the customer service desk maintained a polite but practiced expression, the kind that came from years of dealing with difficult passengers. "I understand, ma'am," she said evenly, "but the flight to Anchorage has already departed. Once it lands, we'll coordinate to have your luggage returned on the next available flight." Karen barely heard the words. Her thoughts were spiraling. Her bag containing her expensive outfits, luxury skincare products, designer accessories was somewhere over the Pacific, heading to a city she had never even planned to visit. And she was still stuck in this airport, her dignity in tatters. She drew in a sharp breath. "Let me speak to your supervisor." The woman blinked but nodded. "One moment, please." As she turned away to make a call, Karen rubbed her temples, willing herself to stay calm. This could still be salvaged. She just needed to. "Karen." A voice called her name from behind. She froze. Not again. Turning slowly, she came face to face with an Asian man in his 40s, dressed in a sharp business suit. His expression was one of recognition bordering on amusement. Karen scrambled through her memory, but his face was a blur. He, however, seemed to remember her quite well. "I thought I recognized you," he mused, shaking his head. "Last year. Tokyo. The visa office." Karen's breath caught in her throat. Tokyo. She did remember. Or rather, she remembered the incident. A year ago, she had planned an extravagant vacation to Japan. But when she was told at the airport that her visa had an issue, she had reacted poorly. More than poorly. She had demanded special treatment, berated the staff, and thrown such a fit that security had been called. Ultimately, she had been denied entry and forced to cancel her entire trip. And now, standing in front of her, was the official who had handled her case. "Unbelievable," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "You really get around, don't you?" Karen clenched her jaw. "This is a coincidence," she snapped. "And frankly, I don't have time for whatever this is." The man chuckled. "I see you haven't changed." Karen turned back toward the counter, pretending he wasn't there. But her fingers were trembling against her suitcase handle. This day was turning into a nightmare. Her phone was useless. Her luggage was gone. And now people from her past mistakes were appearing out of thin air, like ghosts sent to haunt her. She needed to get out of here. Karen glanced up at the flight status board. If she could just book a new ticket first class, obviously she could be on her way and leave this humiliation behind. She pulled out her wallet, ready to pay whatever it took, and turned back to the agent at the counter. But before she could speak, the woman gave her a tight-lipped smile. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but our system shows that you requested a flight cancellation earlier today. Your ticket is no longer valid." Karen's blood ran cold. "What?" she snapped. "I never canceled my flight." The agent turned the screen toward her. And sure enough, there it was, a cancellation request, submitted hours ago. Karen's mind raced. How? She had never made that request. Then it hit her. The check-in counter. She had been so furious at not getting an upgrade that she had snapped at the staff and threatened to cancel her flight if they didn't meet her demands. Had they taken her at her word? Karen swallowed hard. "Well, just book me a new one." The woman hesitated. "I can do that, ma'am. But what? There's no more first-class availability on your route today." Karen nearly reeled back. "What about business class?" "Full as well." Karen inhaled sharply. "Fine. Just economy, then? The woman checked. Then she looked up, almost sympathetically. I'm sorry, but the last economy ticket on that flight was just booked a minute ago. Karen felt the floor shift beneath her. No, this wasn't happening. You mean the next available flight for you will be tomorrow morning? Karen's breath came short. That meant she was stuck here. She gripped the counter as the reality set in. No flight, no lounge access, no luggage, no phone. And based on how today was going, no one who would offer to help. Then, just to make matters worse, she heard laughter. Slow, deliberate, amused. Jamal. Karen didn't even have to look. She could feel his smirk from across the terminal. And for the first time in her life, she felt truly powerless. Karen stood frozen at the customer service counter, her fingers gripping the edge as if sheer willpower could change what she had just heard. No flight until tomorrow. No luggage. No access to the VIP lounge. She swallowed hard, refusing to let the panic show on her face. This is unacceptable, she said, forcing her voice to remain steady. There has to be something else. Another airline. A private charter. Something. The customer service agent, still maintaining her professional demeanor, tapped at the keyboard. I'm afraid all flights to your destination are fully booked for today, she said. You're welcome to check with other airlines, but availability is extremely limited. Karen could feel the sweat forming at the nape of her neck. This wasn't supposed to happen. People like her didn't get stranded in airports like some backpacking college student. Behind her, the sounds of the terminal buzzed announcements over the PA system, the rhythmic beeping of a golf cart transporting passengers, the distant murmur of travelers waiting for their flights. Karen took a deep breath. She had two options. 1. Stay here and figure out a way to make this miserable experience bearable. 2. Find a way to turn the situation in her favor. She was about to insist that the agent check again when a soft giggle. Not from a flight attendant. Not from an adult. From a child. Karen turned her head, eyes narrowing at a little girl standing a few feet away with her mother. She had curly pigtails, big bright eyes, and a stuffed panda clutched in her arms. And she was staring right at Karen with an expression of pure amusement. Then, without hesitation, the girl leaned toward her mother and whispered something. Karen caught only the last part. Like a Disney villain. A fresh wave of heat surged up Karen's neck. The mother let out a small gasp and quickly hushed her daughter. But it was too late. The words had landed. Karen felt the sting more than she cared to admit. A Disney villain? She had always prided herself on being a woman of class and standards. But now, in the eyes of a 10-year-old, she had been reduced to some cartoonish antagonist, a caricature of entitlement. This was a nightmare. Karen turned back toward the counter, regaining her composure. Fine, she snapped. I'll book a hotel. The agent nodded. Certainly. Would you like us to recommend? I can handle it myself, Karen interrupted, grabbing her phone before remembering her phone was disconnected. Her grip on the device tightened. The agent seemed to hesitate, then offered, There's a public Wi-Fi kiosk just outside this terminal if you need access. Karen hated public kiosks. They were disgusting, covered in fingerprints, used by who knows how many people before her. But she had no choice. Grabbing her suitcase, she turned sharply, determined to walk away with some dignity, left only to stop short. Maria. The same Maria from the VIP lounge. Only now, she wasn't behind a counter. She was standing in line at the gate with a boarding pass in hand. Karen blinked. What then? Over the PA system, attention, passengers. We are pleased to offer a complimentary first-class upgrade to our most valued frequent flyer, Maria Alvarez. Karen's stomach dropped. Maria? Maria was getting a first-class upgrade? The same woman who had told her she wasn't eligible for the lounge? Karen stood frozen as Maria turned toward the counter, flashing her boarding pass. Then, as if sensing Karen's burning gaze, Maria looked directly at her and smiled. Not a smug smile. Not an "I told you so" smile. Just a genuine, warm, effortless smile. As if to say, this is what happens when you treat people with kindness. The realization hit Karen harder than she wanted to admit. For the first time that day, maybe in a long time, Karen felt completely invisible. And she hated it. Karen stood rooted to the spot, her grip tightening around her suitcase handle as Maria disappeared into the first-class boarding lane. She should have been there. That should have been me. But instead, she was here stranded, luggageless, disconnected, and, worst of all, being ignored. Karen had always believed that status and money dictated treatment, that people like her, the right people, were naturally entitled to the best. But today had shattered that belief. Because Maria, a mere lounge receptionist, was now settling into a plush first-class seat, while Karen, once so sure of her place at the top, was left scrambling just to book a hotel. It was humiliating. And it wasn't over. She turned back to the customer service counter. "Fine," she snapped. "I need a hotel, one of the best ones nearby." The agent nodded, clicking through options. "We have partnerships with several premium hotels." "Would you like 5-star only?" Karen interrupted. A pause. Then, "The nearest 5-star hotel is fully booked tonight due to a corporate event." "I can check other options," Karen exhaled sharply. "Of course it's booked," she muttered. The agent continued, "There are luxury 4-star accommodations available, just 10 minutes from here for stars." Karen said, as if she had been insulted. "That's barely acceptable." The agent's polite smile didn't waver. "Would you like me to book it, ma'am?" Karen hesitated. What other choice did she have? Sleeping in the airport was not an option. "Fine." As the agent processed the booking, Karen glanced at her useless phone again. She needed Wi-Fi. Public kiosks were disgusting, but she refused to ask a stranger for help. Clutching her suitcase, she marched toward the Wi-Fi station near the waiting area. It was occupied. A college student was hunched over the keyboard, headphones on, typing at rapid speed. Karen cleared her throat. "Excuse me." The student didn't react. Karen's patience had already been shredded to pieces, and this was the last straw. "Young man, excuse me," she said louder. The student finally looked up, pulling off his headphones. "Sorry." Karen gestured at the kiosk. "I need to use this." "You're done, right?" The student blinked, then glanced at the countdown timer on the screen, still showing 9 minutes remaining for his session. He said, "I still have time left." Karen's eyes narrowed. "You're just sitting there. You can do whatever you're doing later." The student's brows lifted slightly. "That's not how this works." Karen folded her arms. "Look, I don't think you understand. I need to use this now." A second passed. Then click. Karen looked down. The student had taken a picture of her with his webcam. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" she snapped. The student smirked. "Oh, nothing. Just making sure I remember this moment. You know, for when I tell my friends about the lady who demanded I give up my Wi-Fi session like she owned the airport." Karen's face burned. He was mocking her. And judging by the subtle looks from other people nearby, she wasn't winning this interaction. She gritted her teeth. "Fine. Enjoy your little session." With that, she spun on her heel, dragging her suitcase toward the nearest airport cafe. She'd buy something expensive, use their Wi-Fi, and "Excuse me, ma'am." Karen stopped. She turned to see Officer Reynolds approaching her, his expression unreadable. A knot formed in her stomach. "What now?" she said, exhausted. He held up a piece of paper. "We just received a report from another airline regarding a previous incident involving you. Can you confirm that you were involved in a dispute at JFK's VIP lounge last year?" Karen's breath hitched. The old man in the lounge, he had recognized her. And now it was on record. Reynolds sighed. "Airport security is requesting that we escort you to the administrative office. They'd like to have a word with you." Karen's pulse pounded. She knew what this meant. This wasn't just about today. This was everything catching up to her. Her past tantrums, her entitled outbursts, the way she had treated staff like Maria, like the flight attendant, like countless others who had probably filed complaints. And now, instead of sitting in first class, sipping champagne, she was about to be escorted like a problem to be handled. Karen inhaled sharply, but no words came. For the first time, there was no escape. Karen followed Officer Reynolds through the terminal, her suitcase rolling unevenly behind her. Each step felt heavier than the last. She tried to compose herself, lifting her chin slightly as if she had chosen this course of action instead of being escorted like a problem. This wasn't how today was supposed to go. She should have been sipping champagne in the VIP lounge, boarding a first-class seat, being respected. Instead, she was being led toward the airport administrative office, where some faceless bureaucrat would decide what to do with her. The humiliation was suffocating. As she passed by the waiting areas, she swore she heard whispers. Travelers glanced up, some with curiosity, others with recognition. Was it her imagination, or were they talking about her? She gritted her teeth. Karen wasn't used to this. She had built her life on status, on making people feel small before they could do the same to her. Now she was the one shrinking. They reached a set of frosted glass doors labeled Airport Administration, authorized personnel only. Reynolds swiped his badge and pushed the door open, leading her inside. Karen barely had time to take in her surroundings before she was directed into a small meeting room. The walls were bare except for a large clock ticking steadily above the table. A woman in a crisp navy suit was already seated inside, a folder open before her. She looked up, her expression unreadable. "Ms. Johnson," she said, "please have a seat." Karen hesitated, then reluctantly sat down. The woman introduced herself as Ms. Patel, head of passenger relations and security compliance. Karen had no idea what that meant, but the way Patel folded her hands on the table told her this wasn't a conversation she could dismiss. "We've reviewed several reports concerning your behavior in airport facilities," Patel began, flipping through the folder. "Not just today, but over the past few years." Karen stiffened. "This is ridiculous. What does my past have to do with anything? I had a minor misunderstanding with lounge staff today." Patel didn't blink. "A misunderstanding? Ms. Johnson, you attempted to bypass lounge policies, harassed employees, and publicly demeaned other passengers. That alone would warrant action." Karen's breath caught. "But," Patel continued, "this isn't the first time, is it?" She turned the folder around, tapping a printed complaint from JFK Airport. Karen swallowed. "Similar incidents at LAX, Chicago O'Hare, and Heathrow," Patel continued. "A history of verbal abuse toward airline and lounge staff. In some cases, temporary bans. In others, formal warnings. And now today." Karen's hands curled into fists on her lap. "So what, you're going to ban me from the airport?" she scoffed. "You can't do that." Patel tilted her head slightly, as if considering. "You'd be surprised what we can do." A sharp silence filled the room. Karen forced herself to breathe evenly. "I have rights," she said, voice measured. "I was a paying customer. I have every reason to expect quality service, but you weren't paying for the lounge today, were you?" Patel interjected smoothly. Karen froze. Patel leaned back, arms folded. "You attempted to enter an exclusive area without valid access. Then, when questioned, you directed complaints toward passengers instead of addressing your own mistake." Karen opened her mouth, then closed it. This wasn't an argument she could win. Patel sighed, as if already tired of the conversation. "I'm not here to argue with you, Ms. Johnson. I'm here to inform you that your actions have consequences." She slid a paper across the table. Karen hesitated before looking down. Her stomach dropped. It was an official misconduct notice, not just for today, but a cumulative record of complaints. At the bottom, stamped in bold letters, "Subject to temporary ban from airline lounge access. 12 months." Karen's heart pounded. You're banning me from VIP lounges?" "For a year," Patel confirmed. "Across multiple major airports, including this one." Karen could barely process the words. A year? 12 months of being treated like a regular passenger? No priority access. No complimentary first-class upgrades. No place to retreat from the crowds of economy travelers. Karen felt sick. "You can't be serious," she whispered. Patel remained calm, collected, unwavering. "You have the right to file an appeal. But given the repeated offenses on record, I doubt the decision will change." Karen's world spun. This was worse than losing her luggage. Worse than her phone being disconnected. She wasn't just being kicked out of a lounge. She was being removed from the circle of privilege she had spent years cultivating. This was real punishment. A slow, sinking feeling settled in her chest. For the first time, Karen realized she was truly, completely alone. Karen stared at the document in front of her, the bold black letters stamping out what felt like the end of her world. Banned. 12 months without access to VIP lounges. No first-class treatment. No complimentary perks. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the paper, as if touching it would somehow make it less real. "This is absurd," she muttered, shaking her head. "You're punishing me for what?" "Expecting better service." Patel didn't flinch. "We're holding you accountable for repeated violations of airport policies and for your behavior toward staff and passengers." Karen forced out a short, bitter laugh. "Accountable? I spend more on airfare in a year than most people make in a lifetime. I've been loyal to these airlines for years. And you're telling me none of that matters?" Patel met her gaze evenly. "Loyalty isn't a free pass for mistreating people, Ms. Johnson." Karen's breath hitched. That sentence so plain, so unforgiving cut deeper than she expected. She had always believed that status protected her, that money and reputation kept doors open, that she could brush off complaints because, in the end, she was the kind of person who belonged in first class. But right now, she felt no different from a coach passenger stranded at a crowded gate. Patel tapped the folder lightly. "This decision is final. You're free to fly, of course, but without lounge privileges or priority services. If we receive any further complaints regarding your conduct, we may escalate this to a more permanent ban." Karen felt her stomach tighten. Permanent? She gritted her teeth, forcing herself to breathe. No, that wasn't going to happen. She just had to ride this out 12 months, a temporary setback. She straightened, smoothing out her jacket as she pushed the paper away. "Fine," she said, trying to sound indifferent. "If that's all, I assume I'm free to go." Patel nodded. "You are. Security will escort you back to the main terminal." Karen's jaw clenched at the word escort. They were still treating her like a problem. Still treating her like she couldn't be trusted to walk out on her own. She rose stiffly from her chair, rolling her suitcase behind her as Officer Reynolds opened the door. She didn't look back. The walk through the terminal was longer than it should have been. Karen kept her eyes forward, ignoring the curious glances, ignoring the whispers. She swore she heard in passing. She had never noticed how crowded airports were until today. The lounges had always provided an escape, an invisible wall between her and the rest of the travelers. Now that wall was gone, and she was just like everyone else. Her heart pounded as she stepped into the main concourse. She needed to get to the cafe, get Wi-Fi, book a hotel, and Karen. She froze. No, not again. Slowly she turned. A middle-aged woman with shoulder-length blonde hair and an expensive coat was standing near a newsstand, looking at her with recognition. Karen's stomach dropped. She knew exactly who this was. Victoria Hale. A former acquaintance, someone Karen had once networked with at exclusive events, spa retreats, and luxury fundraisers. Victoria's perfectly plucked eyebrows lifted in mild surprise. "What are you doing out here?" Karen stiffened. The way she said it, like Karen wasn't supposed to be in the regular terminal, like she had somehow been demoted, made her blood boil. Her mind raced for an excuse. "Oh, I just decided to walk around for a bit." Victoria tilted her head. "Oh." She gestured toward the VIP entrance nearby. "I just came from the lounge. It's quite nice today. You should." She paused, eyes narrowing slightly. Karen saw the moment the realization dawned on her. "You're not in the lounge, are you?" Karen's face burned. She opened her mouth to respond, to lie, to brush it off, to say anything, but no words came. Victoria's lips curled slightly, like a cat that had found something interesting to toy with. "My dear," she murmured, voice light but dripping with amusement, "did you get banned?" Karen felt sick. Victoria wasn't asking because she cared. She was asking because she was entertained. And in this world, The world Karen had worked so hard to be a part of being an object of entertainment was worse than being invisible. Karen forced a smile, a sharp, brittle thing. Just a misunderstanding. It'll be sorted out soon. Victoria's gaze flicked down to her suitcase. Well, I hope so. It would be a shame if you had to travel like everyone else. Karen's fingers tightened around her suitcase handle. Then, with a small smirk, Victoria turned and walked away, disappearing through the VIP entrance without looking back. Karen stood frozen, her humiliation settling in like concrete. She wasn't just banned. She was falling. And the people who once stood beside her, they were already watching from above. Karen stood in the middle of the terminal, gripping the handle of her suitcase so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Victoria Hale's parting words still rang in her ears. It would be a shame if you had to travel like everyone else. The humiliation burned hotter than ever. Karen had always prided herself on being above the chaos of airports, the crowds, the long lines, the noise. She had belonged to a higher class, floating above the inconvenience that ordinary travelers had to endure. Now, for the first time in years, she saw the airport from the other side. And she hated it. She took a shaky breath, forcing herself to focus. There was still a way to regain control. The first step? Get out of here. Karen straightened her shoulders and strode toward the airport cafe, the only place she could think of that might have stable Wi-Fi. She refused to use the public kiosk again. She wouldn't humiliate herself twice in one day. The cafe was busy, filled with exhausted travelers hunched over laptops, sipping overpriced coffee. Karen spotted a small open table near the back and hurried toward it, relieved to finally claim a small space of control in this disaster of a day. She sat down, took out her laptop, and reached for her phone before remembering it was still disconnected. Karen clenched her jaw. It's fine. Just use the Wi-Fi. She opened her laptop and clicked on the airport's Wi-Fi network. A loading screen appeared, asking for login information. She selected the premium Wi-Fi option, ready to enter her frequent flyer credentials error. Membership not recognized. Karen's heart sank. Of course. Her lounge privileges had been revoked. That included Wi-Fi perks. She stared at the screen, willing it to change, to somehow correct itself. But the message remained. She was locked out, and if she wanted access, she'd have to pay. Her stomach twisted. She hadn't paid for Wi-Fi in years. It had always been included complimentary, a privilege of her status. And now, she was no different from the college students, the budget travelers, the exhausted parents balancing toddlers on their laps. Karen inhaled sharply, clicking on the basic free Wi-Fi option instead. It was slower, but it worked. She quickly pulled up a hotel booking site, scanning for a last-minute luxury hotel. Something 5-star, something that would at least give her back a sense of control. She found one. The Chateau Grand Luxe, just 20 minutes from the airport. Expensive, exclusive, exactly what she needed. She clicked Book Now. Processing. Then payment declined. Karen's entire body went cold. She stared at the message, her brain refusing to process it. Declined? She quickly opened another tab, logging into her credit card account. Her Platinum Travel cards, the ones she used exclusively for VIP perks, should have more than enough to cover a simple hotel booking. But as soon as the account balance loaded, her stomach dropped. Her card had been flagged for security review. Karen's hands shook. That upgrade argument at the check-in counter earlier. She had threatened to cancel her flight out of frustration. Had they taken that as an actual request and flagged her account? She scrolled further. The system had temporarily restricted transactions related to travel expenses until the issue was resolved. And because her phone was cut off, she couldn't even call her bank to fix it. Karen sat frozen, staring at the screen. No lounge. No luggage. No flight until tomorrow. No hotel. No phone. No access to her own money. For the first time in her entire adult life, she was stuck. Not temporarily inconvenienced. Not mildly frustrated. Truly, completely stuck. Her hands trembled slightly as she closed the laptop. She needed a new plan. Maybe she could ask the hotel to hold a room and pay later. Maybe she could try another credit card. "Excuse me, ma'am." Karen's head snapped up. A barista stood at her table, a polite but firm expression on her face. "We have a 30-minute limit on seating for non-paying customers," the woman said. "Would you like to order something?" Karen blinked. Aye. Her gaze darted to the menu board. A basic coffee was $5.50. She reached for her wallet. But no credit card. No mobile payment. Her stomach churned. For years, she had never thought about buying a simple cup of coffee. It had always been charged to her account automatically, included in first-class lounges, handed to her on silver trays. Now, she was being asked to pay, and for the first time, she wasn't sure if she could. "I just need a few more minutes," she said stiffly. The barista hesitated. Then, with a small nod, she turned and walked away. Karen exhaled shakily. Her situation was getting worse. By the second, she needed a lifeline. She looked around the cafe, scanning the room. There were plenty of people she could ask for help. She could fake a polite smile, pretend she had simply misplaced her card, ask for a small favor, but when she pictured herself doing it, something inside her recoiled. Karen Johnson didn't ask for help. She wasn't that kind of person. And yet, as she sat there, stranded in an airport she once thought of as her playground, she realized she didn't have a choice anymore. Karen sat motionless at the cafe table, her hands resting over her closed laptop as if gripping it tightly could somehow stop the world from spinning out of her control. She had spent years curating an image of wealth, power, privilege. And now, in the course of a single afternoon, she had been stripped of all of it. Her phone was disconnected. Her luggage was gone. Her flight wasn't until tomorrow. Her VIP access had been revoked for an entire year. And worst of all, she didn't have access to her own money to book a hotel or even buy a cup of coffee. For the first time in her life, she was just like everyone else. No worse. Because unlike them, she had never learned how to navigate a world without special treatment. She could feel people moving around her in the cafe, business travelers checking their phones, exhausted parents sipping coffee while their kids fidgeted in their seats. None of them were looking at her. No one cared that Karen Johnson had fallen from grace. Her throat tightened. She needed a plan. Karen opened her laptop again, clicking through hotel websites, searching for anything cheap enough to be covered by her other card, a basic one she rarely used, but might still work. She winced as she scrolled past two-star options. She had spent years turning her nose up at budget hotels. Now, she might not have a choice. Her finger hovered over a $79 airport motel, a place she wouldn't have stepped foot in before today, when she heard someone clear their throat. She looked up and froze. Jamal Carter stood across from her table. Karen's stomach twisted. She hadn't heard him approach, and now, standing before her with his hands casually in his pockets, he looked calm. Not smug, not cruel, just curious. He tilted his head slightly. "You've been sitting here a while." Karen clenched her jaw. "And?" Jamal studied her for a moment. Then, in an infuriatingly smooth voice, he asked, "Need help?" The words hit her like a slap. Karen's fingers curled into her palms. "I don't need anything from you." Jamal arched an eyebrow. "You sure?" Her pulse spiked. He knew. Somehow, he knew exactly what had happened. The way his eyes flicked to her laptop, then to the untouched cafe menu, told her he had already put the pieces together. Karen swallowed hard. "I'll be fine." Jamal didn't move. He glanced over at the barista, the same one who had asked Karen to buy something or leave. Then, with a shrug, he stepped toward the counter. Karen watched as he pulled out his wallet and ordered 2 coffees. One for him, one for her. Her face burned. When he returned, he placed the cup in front of her without a word. She stared at it. The last time she had been offered something for free, she had scoffed at it, acted as if generosity was beneath her. Now she was too humiliated to even say thank you. Jamal slid into the seat across from her, sipping his coffee. "You know," he said after a long moment, "I saw this coming." Karen stiffened. "Excuse me." Jamal gestured vaguely around them. "Not just today. This." He nodded toward her closed laptop. This whole situation. Karen bristled. You don't know anything about me. Jamal exhaled slowly, shaking his head. Karen, I've met 100 people like you. Her stomach twisted. Like me? Jamal leaned forward slightly. The ones who think power comes from looking down on people. That money and status are shields. Until the day they aren't. Karen's nails dug into her palm. Jamal continued. And when it all comes crashing down, they don't know how to function without it. He tilted his head. Sound familiar? Karen's chest tightened. Because he was right. She had never been in a position where she wasn't in control. And now, stripped of her privileges, she felt powerless. It was terrifying. Jamal sighed, then leaned back in his chair. You've got two choices, he said. You can sit here, pretending this didn't happen. Or, he nodded toward the airport exit. You can figure out how to move forward. Karen stared at him. For years, she had dismissed people like Jamal, people who didn't flaunt their wealth, who didn't need to prove they were important. But now, in her lowest moment, he was offering her something no one else had. Perspective. Karen looked down at the coffee he had bought her. It wasn't first-class champagne. It wasn't a luxury service. It was a simple act of kindness. And for the first time in her life, she felt what it was like to be on the receiving end of generosity without demanding it. Karen swallowed her pride. Then, slowly, hesitantly, she reached for the cup and took a sip. It was the first thing that had gone right all day. As Karen sat there, sipping her coffee, she realized something she had never considered before. Privilege wasn't about wealth or status, but how you treated others when you had it. For years, she had measured her worth by the exclusivity of the places she could access, by the power she held over people she deemed beneath her. But now, stripped of it all, she was seeing the world from the other side. And maybe, just maybe, this was a lesson she had needed all along. What do you think? Have you ever witnessed someone who let their status get to their head? Or maybe you've seen someone learn a lesson the hard way. Let us know in the comments. And tell us, where in the world are you watching from? If you enjoyed the story, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode.